Welcome to Happy Times and Places, in which I, Toby Hadoke, watch a Doctor Who story chosen by a friend of mine, and I have to commentate along, pick out some salient facts, and try to guess what my special guest's favourite things about each episode are, whilst all the time accentuating the positive.
Hello there, and hello to all of you viewing at home. Oh, no, maybe that's the wrong story. Hello, my name is Jeremy Bentham, and Toby's asked me to introduce myself. Well, I'm one of the, what Doctor Who magazine likes to call, one of the last of the few who are actually still around to watch the original stories of Doctor Who from the very beginning. I was a child in the 60s, and in the 1970s I was privileged to become part of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society when it was first formed, one of the first networks to actually start bringing fans together, which it has done successfully ever since. In 1979 I was catapulted from the class into Doctor Who magazine when it was still called Doctor Who Weekly, and Deskin asked me to become the principal writer and contributing editor for that publication, something I was very pleased to do for at least 2 or 3 years. By that point I'd actually started my own research project for Cybermark Services called Doctor Who: An Adventure in Space and Time, which later mutated into becoming Doctor Who: Vision, one of the first attempts to try and document, story by story, all of the serials of Doctor Who in what is now known as its classic era. In between that time, yes, I've written a few books, contributed to what seems like an awful lot of videos and projects, and for my films I am still contacted by people, mostly these days about people that want to know a little bit more about the Doctor Who's early days, which is why I'm very pleased to nominate as my Doctor Who story for Toby's enterprise, Marco Polo. Why have I chosen Marco Polo? Well, partly I think to redress the balance between all the people who are probably great fans of the new series and try and level up the balance a little bit more, perhaps in favour of the classic series, and importantly those series which we can no longer watch because they no longer exist in the archives. And Marco Polo is the earliest example of that, and for me it's a very, very special story. It's my Jekyll and Hyde story in a way, or perhaps Hyde and Jekyll would be another way of looking at it, because when I first watched it as a child I was very much impatient with it and it wasn't top of my list. Why? Well, because those guys weren't in it. I was one of the original Doctor Who Dalek fans, and by the time we were getting to Marco Polo I was already making little model Daleks out of corks and pins and anything that I could possibly lay on my hands on to actually construct a Dalek. So suddenly finding yourself confronted by a 7-part story that was historical in nature, at the time didn't seem like a great advance. If anything, you were going back to Sunday serial days. Now if we go forward a few more years to the 1980s, this was when, as a member of the Appreciation Society and just getting my toe in the water with Marvel Comics, I was first allowed access to the BBC's wonderful script library that was in Brentford at that time. Not in Brentford, it was in Western Avenue in those days. And that's where I first came across the script for Marco Polo. And it really was an absolute journey of discovery because, for whatever reason, when I was at the script library that day, I was not researching Marco Polo, I was looking at something else totally different. But I saw the folder on the shelf, picked it out, and picked out the 7 wonderful scripts of this story and just started reading. I realised halfway through I'd just about read the entire script and wasted probably a considerable amount of the time for which I was ostensibly there, but realised I'd become absolutely mesmerised by the storyline that Marco Polo unfolds over a course of, 3,000 miles in terms of the distance travelled in that serial, and the 6 months plus it takes the travellers their time to go from the plains of Pamir to the Khan's palace at Peking. And I was absolutely enraptured. Even more so when a few years later Mark Ayres did his superb work in restoring the tape recordings originally made by Richard Landon and David Holman, I think. David Holman? Yes, David Holman. And bringing those up to light and getting them issued as part of the BBC's audio collection. So for the first time we could actually sit down and in audio only enjoy this superb 7-part story, which is unique for so many reasons, which I'll be outlining, I hope, later on with Toby's collaboration. So if you've got an opportunity, for heaven's sakes, either stream this or dig this out of your library, switch the lights down low, crank the volume up, and prepare to involve yourself in one of Doctor Who's most spectacular adventure. An adventure which I can only describe as a magnificent chess game which runs its course through parts 1 to 7. So, without further ado, Toby, it's back over to you, mate.
Well, hello everybody, and yikes! I've got to do 7 missing episodes of Doctor Who. So a story I will admit I don't know as well as most, I would think. How many times have I seen this? I think I've heard the soundtrack, gosh, maybe just the once, and I've watched a reconstruction twice. So a Doctor Who story I've probably experienced only 3 times. And I've got a feeling the episode 7 I listened to, the episode 7 I have of the BBC CD soundtrack, was a bit jumpy on episode 7. So, yeah, I'm going to be a bit jumpy for the next 7 episodes, because this is not a story I know especially well. It wasn't one of the ones... I did have a few soundtracks in the days when you had to get them on cassette, and it sounded like they'd been recorded underwater with all of the actors wearing socks and 100 miles away and drowning. But I didn't get Marco Polo. I was after the Troughtons. That's what I was after when I was a youngster, who briefly dallied with getting the soundtracks, but they were quite a hard listen, and they weren't, I'm talking about before the time that they had narration on. Although I have some sympathy with people who say, I shouldn't have narration on, you should just be able to work out what's going on. You think, yeah, you are a purist, and also someone who has no commercial sense whatsoever. Because, it is, they are television soundtracks. They are not designed to be consumed without some form of assistance. In the case of, television, in the case of episodes of television, the assistance was all the things you could see that you no longer can. But what a miracle that from 14 weeks into Doctor Who's existence, we have episodes that no longer exist. And yet somebody, even then, was recording them so that we have the soundtracks. That is nothing short of a miracle. We have the soundtrack of every... And of course, when most people talk about the soundtrack to a movie, they mean the score that's recorded separately and added on, and that's why you listen to movie soundtracks. I think some people don't quite realise that when we say we listen to the soundtrack, it means we actually listen to an audio version of a thing we don't have pictures for. But isn't that a miracle? But that means we have these pictureless, and Marco Polo, of course, weirdly, was one of those ones before I knew that it was missing. I felt it was a story I knew quite well because there were loads of photos of it. So like, oh gosh, there's all. Hang on, it doesn't exist, because it seemed odd. I mean, of course, there's no correlation between photos taken on the studio floor, when it was being made, and the destruction of tape several years later. But it seemed odd to have something that we had so much of that we didn't have. Anyway, and I've just realised I've probably not downloaded Jeremy Bentham, who you have already heard this episode, who is, a legend of fandom. His book, Doctor Who: The Early Years, was an early Christmas present. I say it was an early Christmas present for me. Well, it was. It was a Christmas present for me in my younger days, and also Christmas present that my mum had got when we'd visited Longleat, probably in about, I don't know, I'm guessing, the August, September. And there was a Doctor Who shop there. And it was the days where you had to go to specific shop for things. So I think she'd stocked up for Christmas on that visit when my back was turned, and had hidden various things, including my main present, which was Doctor Who: The Early Years, in a cupboard and I found it. And I'm not a spoilers person, but I would occasionally go and have a little flick, and I would, didn't read any of the text, but I looked at some of the pictures and read the cast lists. Those were the things I allowed myself. But yeah, I cheated and had sneak previews of that present. But I admire my own restraint. And so Jeremy is a legendary figure, and I had the pleasure of meeting him relatively recently. It's 10 years ago now, but seeing as I encountered quite a few Who people prior to that, Jeremy very humbly sort of sent me an email going, I'm involved with Doctor Who fandom. I know who you are. You're a legend and a learned man, and one of the pioneers of Doctor Who fandom and Doctor Who magazine and Doctor Who research, and I have a great respect for such people. And as Ian McLachlan proved, the people that were there at the time are indeed very, very interesting contributors to Doctor Who history. And I was worried about doing the Dalek Master Plan, which has been one of the podcasts I've done that has had the best feedback, and that is due in no small part to such a fantastic guest in Ian, who was there at the time, giving his insights from the time. So you've heard Jeremy's introduction, and it's probably clear what a fascinating and intelligent fellow he is. So he's going to provide us with food for thought, and perspective from the time, whereas I am going to improvise my way through. I'm looking at this. Episode 1 has a running time of 24 minutes and 13 seconds, so that's quite a long one as well. A story that I've seen very infrequently, that doesn't exist, and my goodness, let's see what happens. So I will be watching the loose cannon reconstruction on a little tablet here. So it's with fear that I embark upon an epic journey. Where's Marco Polo to narrate it when you need him? And we're going to begin on the roof of the world. And we're going to press play in 3, 2, 1. I have just realised I could have said quite a lot of that during the episode, but I'm nothing if not really bloody stupid. So anyway, this is Doctor Who. This is the first missing episode of Doctor Who, and what a shame. We are always very tempted to, view the past, the lost past, with rose-tinted spectacles, but certainly everybody that worked on Marco Polo seems to adore it. I know that Waris Hussein, who I've had the pleasure of speaking to and meeting on several occasions, is desperately unhappy that Marco Polo is missing, and genuinely thinks it was, a superior quality piece of work. I am predisposed to like the historicals anyway. I question myself as to this, because I like Doctor Who because it's an exciting sci-fi adventure, and it wasn't an historical series when I grew up watching it, and I don't remember being particularly blown away by Black Orchid, and I remember doing I'll talk about that maybe later. Some of these scenes are quite familiar because Doctor Who, the 20th anniversary Radio Time special, had a big picture, I think, of the four of them outside the TARDIS in this episode. And there's that picture, isn't there, of Hartnell by the TARDIS door that was in Doctor Who: A Celebration, and there's this picture of Ian and Barbara that I'm looking at right now, with him with his arm round the outside the TARDIS. So there's lots of beautiful, gorgeous pictures, many of them in full colour, that really capture the grandeur, but of course make the story look actually more impressive than it will have done in black and white, bizarrely. Now, I love black and white, and I love the atmosphere of black and white, but there's so much of what makes Marco Polo so gorgeous is that we have these lovely full colour pictures, and that Barry Newbury, the designer, and all of the costumes that they have as well are fabulous. I love Hartnell in these opening scenes. He's really grumpy. He's quite I remember he's quite. I mean, the doctor changes actually from story to story, and particularly in these early days. Oh, there's that picture of Susan being cold and the doctor but he's really quite grumpy and slightly very annoyed and irascible. Quite often people write up the Hartnell doctor, or certainly people that worked at the time say, oh yes, he was an irascible doctor. I think Hartnell was quite an irascible fellow. Actually, his doctor isn't always that irascible. He's sometimes very lovely and dotty, and but yeah, no, he does get scalloped. But he's genuinely irascible in this first episode, and I actually really like it because it's actually quite funny because he's so cross and so irritated by the situation. But I'm finding it quite refreshing, and I've watched a lot of early Doctor recently because, of course, I'm doing the Too Much Information podcasts, and I've just watched Edge of Destruction, or Inside the Spaceship, whatever you want to call it, about 12 times. But this is a wonderfully traditional start. We start in a hostile environment. An environment is very important to early Doctor Who's. I think we're quite blasé about space and time travel now, whereas then just the very fact that you were being taken to different locales meant that there was danger within the very environment itself. This is cold, they get hot later on and they run out of water, and the idea of being separated from the TARDIS and all of that stuff is built into the jeopardy, which writers like Terry Nation sort of carry on when you think of episode 1 of Planet of the Daleks, where the danger is basically we've landed in a place that's where the environment itself is very hostile, and it's like it's like a sort of another addition to the sort of register of difficulties, the lexicon of threats, if you like. But yes, the historicals. I like them, but do I like them because, one, we don't do them anymore, and two, because they're old and largely lost, and if we had the whole of Doctor Who in existence, would I be rushing to watch Marco Polo and the Massacre and the Mythmakers, 3 stories I say would be very high on my list of stories I'd like to find? But I can do that, can't I? It's all academic. It's not going to affect anything. Do I like the fact that I think I like the historicals? Does that make me feel that I'm clever and I like the lyrical, philosophical stories because there's something somehow dirty about just liking stuff that's sci-fi jeopardy? I worry about my own. It's really weird, these mental gymnastics that we do. It's all right for me to like Marco Polo, and yet I worry that I only like Marco Polo because of how it makes me feel about how I feel about myself and the things I like. But is that? I don't know if that's not because. I know my mind is a slightly topsy-turvy place, but it seems a real unnecessary waste of energy. I could just go, I like Marco Polo. And I think I do. I love his Darren Nesbitt as Tigana, and this is a really interesting piece of casting because if you know Nesbitt's work, he's usually a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, smooth kind of nice. I mean, I love his turn. He's a brilliant number 2 in It's Your Funeral, which is a Marco Polo reunion because the guest stars are Darren Nesbitt, Mark Eden, and Martin Miller, who turns up as Kubla Khan later. And here's Mark Eden, who used to live just up the road from here, where I am now, and actually used to live even closer to where I used to live when I lived for a bit in a flat in town. I had the pleasure of going to Mark's house shortly before he died because we recorded a little interview for the Quatermass and the Pit DVD Blu-ray, but I'd already corresponded with Mark Eden several years previously, and he actually sent me his contract for Quatermass and the Pit because it was his first telly and he'd hung on to it, And he sent me a few memories about Quatermass and the Pit. I thought it was a bit... I didn't ask him about Doctor Who in the letter because I was writing to him about Quatermass, and other people interviewed him about Doctor Who anyway. He was always very, very generous with his time, with his interviews. And he died a couple of years ago now, early last year, and was also the husband of Sue Nichols, who plays Audrey in Coronation Street. And he himself, of course, became famous for being Alan Bradley, a terrible villain in Coronation Street. But at this time, and he's great casting, he's the dashing hero of Marco Polo. And I remember seeing his picture in the paper when he was in Coronation Street at that time and being sort of, oh wow, so he's still going and he's in Coronation Street and he was Marco Polo. But Darren Nesbitt, I didn't see his stuff till later, so I thought of him as quite a sort of burly, dark-haired actor, and he's not. He's a sort of very 60s, very kind of 60s energy and blonde, those blonde sort of tousle locks he has in The Prisoner, and he's the Nazi, isn't he? He's one of the German in, well, there's many Germans, but a key German in Where Eagles Dare. And he also directed a film called The Amorous Milkman, when I think he thought there was money in them their sex comedies. But I think the bubble was about to burst. The udder was about to burst, and the milk went everywhere. No, it's not a metaphor I want to continue with if we're talking about saucy comedies. Anyway, look at this brilliant set design. I'm struck with this, because we think of it as being an epic, and actually it's feeling pretty big, but there's only as many speaking cast in this episode as there are in the Cave People episodes, which I don't think of being as particularly populous. You've got the goody caveman and the baddie caveman and the old man caveman and the old woman caveman and the other woman caveman, and that's it. You think of it being quite a sparse population, even though there's lots of sort of cave people extras. But I always think of Marco Polo because it has actually got quite a long cast list, and we do meet more characters later. But in this episode, there's Marco Polo, Tigana, Ping Cho, and as we will see at the end of the episode, the wonderful credit, you desperate for it on your CV, Man at Lop. Played by Leslie Bates, who we will discuss in about 14 minutes' time. Xenia Merton, I think, is absolutely beautiful, and she has the distinction of having of a certain number of years between Doctor Who universe appearances. She sadly never returned to the show, but she is the registrar in the Sarah Jane Adventures. Is it The Wedding of Sarah Jane Smith, the one that David Tennant comes back in? So that's nice that she played quite a lot of sort of registrars and receptionists, and I remember her turning up in Casualty, I think, as a hotel receptionist, and I'm sure she did something else as a registrar. But I never had the pleasure. I know her agent a bit, Barry Langford. And I did try to interview her for a piece I was planning for Doctor Who magazine that I never ended up doing, and then did get done relatively recently when Marco Polo was released on vinyl. But I'd been charged with, well, you see, I get different versions of this. I've been asked, we might be doing a new way of doing, instead of doing Doctor Who archives, we do Doctor Who in their own words, and you interview people from a particular story, and we sort of break the story down and get quotes from the people. Do you fancy having a go with Marco Polo? So I did. I got in touch with a few people, and then it just sort of went quiet and never happened. And then very recently, Peter Ware said, Did you do anything with those interviews? And I went, well, no, I've got them here. And he said, can we run them? A lot of people went, this says these interviews are from 10 years ago. Is that because Marco Polo was supposed to be coming back and you were preparing an article? Now, if that was the case, I've forgotten, but I don't think it was. I thought I was doing this new way of doing things. but with people saying, but it was around that time when there were rumours that it was going to be Marco Polo and Enemy of the World and Web of Fear. I think that was, or Marco Polo was going to come back after Web of Fear, Enemy of the World. It was certainly in the air that Marco Polo definitely existed, to the extent that if it had turned up, it would have been slightly disappointing because we were all expecting that it already existed anyway. And now, of course, I'm watching this, I go, I would kill to see this. It's a really nice production. But and actually, I'm talking about the sort of small number of cast, but there's quite a few extras there, dressed in the Mongol uniforms, and this set doesn't seem too small. The one on the roof of the world, which gives us a nice sense of scale, and isn't that a lovely title as well? I know the roof of the world is. That's not phraseology unique to Doctor Who. This place is known as the roof of the world, but I still think it's a lovely sort of poetic kind of title that appeals to me much more than mysterious one-line titles, or the Terra Nation, the Return, the Expedition, all of that. I think there's something very poetic about the roof, and indeed the Singing Sands, Wall of Lies. I think I love all of these titles. And what I like about this story actually is that it's an exercise in trust. That Marco Polo is a good guy, and he doesn't actually do anything bad to the travellers, but the travellers do kind of lie to him on occasion. And then he sort of quite reasonably says, well, if you lie to me, how can I trust you? And it's like a sort of series of uneasy alliances between sort of good people. I mean, Tigana's the obvious bad guy. I don't know if you've seen Kieran Hodgson, who I would urge you to follow on Twitter. He's for a while he did sort of condensed versions of Doctor Who stories that were really, really good, but I think he only got as far as Marco Polo. Maybe he did Keys of Marinus as well, and he's done The Crown and various other things. But his one on The Crown is superb. But his one of this is, where he plays all the different people, and he's a very good mimic. But his sort of spoof of Tigana is, yes, I'm very trustworthy. I'm not a bad guy at all. And I do like the fact that Darren Nesbitt goes for sort of purred villainy, and it's certainly better than trying to attempt any sort of accent, because there's no getting over the fact that there's an uneasiness for a modern viewer about a European actor, especially as I say, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Darren Nesbitt. Although actually the makeup and I think it's a wig, but if it's his hair, it's been darkened. Is actually very good. The dark beard, the dark hair, but obviously we have uneasiness, rightly so, about Caucasian actors passing themselves off as different ethnicities. But whilst acknowledging that uneasiness, I'm also not going to waste time berating the past for doing what was the methodology of the time. And I would, and what I always say is, I would challenge anyone now who thinks it's, who goes, well, it's terrible, we wouldn't do it now. No, we wouldn't do it now. But if you worked at the BBC in 1964 and they said, we want Darren Nesbitt as Tigana, you wouldn't stand up and go, no, we need to find an actor of the correct ethnicity, because you wouldn't have done, because the landscape was very different, and priorities were very different, and attitudes were very different. And just because you're from now, that doesn't make you better, because your attitudes and experiences have been shaped by a culmination of the passage of time to get us where we are now. But I also don't think there's anything wrong with going, God, we find that as a modern audience, we find that quite uneasy. That's fine to say as well, and I equally reject people who say, well, it's just a case of getting the right person for the job. Well, now the right person for the job is not a white actor with makeup on. It just really isn't. And if you can't find an actor of the correct ethnicity to play such parts now, then I'm not sure what your classification for the right person for the job is. So I think it's fair enough to acknowledge that it's problematic, but also, without being too lofty about ourselves in the process. A couple of wonderful hats here that Ian and Barbara have. I mean, they're both wearing sort of lampshades. They are glorious hats, aren't they? I think these might be two of the best hats in the whole of Doctor Who, and Doctor Who has some hot hat action a lot of the time. I haven't seen some of these photographs. This reconstruction has some beautiful, beautiful photos. And again, it feels populous and it sounds populous. Yang is played by an actor called Aikida, who isn't credited on screen, but is credited on some cast lists. But he doesn't say anything, so I don't think he was credited on screen, no. So yeah, there's still the Mark Eden, Darren Nesbitt, and for episode 1, the Radio Times said, and introducing Xenia Merton. But she doesn't get that credit on any of the rest of the episodes. But it's nice that she gets a nice credit for part 1. And it's a lovely part, actually, and it's nice that Susan has a sort of mate that she can get to be sort of fun and playful and sort of on a level with, because Susan's quite often treated as a child and talked down to. It's nice that a lot of her scenes she's with somebody who's a sort of equal in terms of age, although obviously now we would say, well, if Susan's a Time Lord, she's much older, but they feel like, you know, they can bat off each other as mates, and I like that dynamic. This, as I say, I was going to be surprised at how small scale this was in terms of the number of speaking characters, but actually the supporting, non-speaking supporting roles actually feel like they're a part of the drama. Because, of course, this is not only a story that takes place on an epic scale time-wise. You know, Marco Polo's, you know, travelling troupe was an awful lot of people. And this, as I say, yes, this does feel. I thought I was going to come out of this and go, actually, this feels a bit smaller than we might expect, because we think of Marco Polo because it's 7 parts, and because it's this epic journey, and because it's got, you know, the maps, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. But I love the little conceit of Marco Polo narrating. That gives the story a unique feel. And in the draft scripts, it was the Travellers that actually did the narration. Certainly the Doctor, but I think the others got a shot as well. But I think it was Waris Hussein, that said, no, let's have Marco narrating it, and I love that. I think that's terribly sweet, and it gives Marco, you know, his own his own special input into the story that's named after him. Although on much of the paperwork it is called A Journey to Cathay. And here we are. Yes, so here's a lovely piece of the drama, and this does seem very real. It would seem to me quite boring now, if a whole drive of part of the story was that the TARDIS was being taken off the Doctor, because the TARDIS we now take for granted. The TARDIS is now a constant within the show, and it would seem like a bit of a cheat, I think, if it's all right in the Satan pit for it to fall down, and we don't really we go, oh, okay, they've got to have the adventure now, but it'll pop up at the end. But here, because it's early in the show, and because, you know, the whole sort of conceit and drive of the show is that these two school teachers are stranded away from their time, and that is part of, you know, the whole jeopardy of the whole thing is that their connection to their home, time and space, is, you know, hanging by a thread, as it were. The idea that the TARDIS may be taken off the Travellers seems to have so much more weight and import here at the dawn of the show than it would now. And I love that. I love that you can go back to different times in the show where things that work perfectly well then that wouldn't work now, or would work differently now. And it's like looking at the show through new eyes. You're going, well, of course, this seems like this is a perfectly good piece of writing, and of course we like Marco, and Marco's not doing anything particularly unpleasant. As far as Marco's concerned, they'll be able to make another ship. If they made this thing, they'll be able to do it again. I'm not sure what I make of the Doctor's laughing. The Doctor is really weird in this episode. And here he has this big laugh, but this is the Doctor being sort of unpredictable, and having been waspish and sort of vicious and terse and irate for the whole thing and quite sort of cross. He's totally unpredictable here, and he's laughing away like an absolute loon, it has to be said. But the punchline is he hasn't got a clue what he's going to do. It's, the laughter is to cover up the fact that they're gonna lose the TARDIS. Which now here's Leslie Bates as Man at Lop, and he has one line, and he's been at the end of an episode before, because he is at the end of episode 1. He is the shadow of Cal, who appears across the landscape on that model shot of the TARDIS. That is Leslie Bates. And the reason he's the shadow is so that they didn't have to play Jeremy Young, who plays Cal, who hadn't been cast then anyway, I don't think. But you wouldn't do that anyway. You wouldn't get the actor playing the part. You wouldn't pay him for the episode before to only see his shadow. With this, Leslie Bates plays Man at Lop and gets a credit because he has one line. But Man at Lop doesn't have a line next week, and so Leslie Bates is replaced by an extra next week. So that's a nice piece of symmetry. It sort of bookends from the first episode where Leslie Bates was there standing in for someone else, and then on his only speaking contribution to Doctor Who, and he turns up in the Green Death. I mean, he's in the show for the first couple of decades, but this is his only credit as Man at Lop. And somebody has to replace him next week so that he doesn't have to get paid for 2 episodes or get a retainer or whatever else. That's one of those nice little pieces of cast list symmetry that is only of interest to me, but I don't care. I've just given you 24 minutes on a missing episode of Doctor Who. Well, I did get distracted quite a lot. There's quite a lot to say about that I didn't say, but I think the fact that the TARDIS, being separated from the TARDIS is a key piece of the jeopardy, I think is very important. And I also like the fact that it's being taken away from them, not by a baddie, but by somebody who has his own very plausible and decent reasons for doing what he's doing, and has his own, dilemma and has his own difficulties to overcome. And I love that dynamic, actually, that lasts the whole story between Ian and Polo of them wanting to be straight with each other, but for expediency not always being straight with each other, and therefore then using the fact that they're not always straight with each other as a reason to go, well, hang on, you lied to me. So I like all of that. That's much more interesting than it just being goodies and baddies or just unambiguous lying or whatever. I think the character dynamics are rather lovely. And yes, talking about Tigana, I got waylaid by the aspect of the ethnicity of the actor, but I think Darren Nesbitt doing the sort of underplayed, purred villainy is better than, as we discover with some other actors later, putting on, and certainly with Peter Laird as Chang in The Wheel in Space, an attempt to sort of do some sort of accent which is at best awkward and at worst offensive. So I think, in terms of as a modern viewer or listener, what Darren Nesbitt does, I think, is a good call, and it makes for a very effective character. And he is, he's a very subtly menacing presence. It's subtle as in low key, as in low played. That I don't think the villain is that subtle. It's pretty obvious he's the bad guy. But that's okay. That's okay. It's still a good performance. So what I think for episode 1, because I think this is going to be chosen at some point, so I may as well choose it for episode 1 because it's the first time we experience it. I have to choose the fact that the story is narrated by Marco Polo and that he has a map and we have the plotting of his journey. I love that. Yes, please. So that is my choice for episode 1. What is J Jeremy Bentham's choice for episode 1 of Marco Polo? The Roof of the World, it says. Over to J Jeremy Bentham.
For the high point of The Roof of the World, I've chosen a subject not usually discussed much on podcasts and even in magazines, and that's Doctor Who's use of lighting, and particularly its lighting in early stories like Marco Polo, which was quite remarkable considering it was filmed in such an old studio. And remember, this wasn't sort of Nightmare of Eden game show flood lighting we're talking about here. We're talking about very intricate lighting that made the very best of the sets that they had and the very best of the facilities that were available to them at the time. I think nowhere illustrates this more so than episodes 1 and 2, where you start off with very, very cold, hard contrast lighting for the plane of Pamir, and watching it as an audience, yes, you get wrapped up in the fact that it's supposed to be very, very cold environments, which then transitions, as we go on in the episode, to softer, warmer contrast lighting for the sets and the scenes that take place inside Marco Polo's tent. All of this, well, a lot of it, I suspect, was down to the lighting supervisor, a chap called John Trees, I believe, on the first few episodes, who apparently suffered so much at the hands of the dictator trying to make these episodes so memorable that he asked to be swapped out of Marco Polo later on because they were getting to be so difficult to light, and I think he was replaced by the ever redoubtable Howard King. But if you want proof of how a tiny little studio can be made to look enormous, look at episode 2, and particularly if you've got the Singing Sands telesnaps available, and look at the shot where Susan and Ping Cho are watching Tigana leaving the tent to go out into the Gobi Desert. It's absolutely spotlit with tiny little circles of light, larger circles nearer to the actresses, smaller circles further away to give you that false perspective sense of depth. It's an amazing way of achieving an epic look to a very, very tiny studio indeed. So guys, please enjoy.
Very good. He's going to be good, isn't he? I mean, the fact that he can extemporize about the lighting of an episode that we can't see, but do so with such great acute observation about the different locales and the different lighting states. And it's true, and that's very interesting because I think of Marco Polo in terms of the epic grandeur of those sets and the beautiful richness of those costumes, which of course you wouldn't see in the final episodes. But he's quite right, what you can discern, and especially as we have since had access to the telesnaps, which when I was a time tot we did not. We had all those design pictures, which again give a slightly false impression of the story in a way. And then suddenly, and this is what I love about the history of Doctor Who coming together, is that for years we didn't have the telesnaps of Marco Polo because we'd got the telesnaps from big chunks of Doctor Who, but not from season 1. But that's okay because it meant there was only 9 episodes from that season that we'd need telesnaps from, and so that's not a great loss, but it would still be nice to have them. And then lo and behold, Waris Hussein's got his 6 episodes, the telesnaps, in his attic. So that of all the stories that we needed the telesnaps from of season 1, well, actually of those 9 episodes, we've a director who we had access to, who hadn't mentioned it for years and years and years, or had forgotten or whatever, but for whatever reason, because we'd been in touch with him, suddenly went, oh yeah, I think I've got, look, these. And then suddenly another little piece of Doctor Who's visual jigsaw comes together. I love that fact, and I love the fact that, this archaeology element means we piece it together from different sources. So yeah, we had an embarrassment of riches with photos, but then we get the telesnaps that actually show us what it looked like on screen, and I think they do, that does add an extra dimension to what the story would have looked like, and I think it does give a sense of the scale of, as I say, how populous the episode is, despite the shortness of the cast list, and of those different sets. And I think that plane of Pamir set, the Roof of the World set, is very key. Obviously, that little hillock that they go over just before they get captured is just, you can imagine it just being a tiny little set in the corner of the studio, and some of the other sets are a little bit bigger, and those are all pieced together to make the episode. And that's some of the genius of putting Doctor Who together as well in the confines of Limes Grove Studio D. John Triers was indeed the lighting director, and indeed he did ask to be removed from Marco Polo because it was a tricky job to light. But actually, I think that's a great choice of Jeremy. I think he'll choose Mark Eden narrating the story at some point, but because I've chosen it for this episode, that means I have it in the bank. So that means I do get a point if he chooses it in, say, episode 5 or as his bonus. Of course, what I lose out on then is obviously whatever I choose for episode 5, he won't be choosing because he's choosing, Mark Eden, Marco Polo, or whatever, or his bonus or whatever. So whilst I get a point, I still sort of lose a point. But nonetheless, that's the mechanics for anyone who really cares about the rules of this game, which I'm sure nobody actually does. If you are keeping a tally, don't. I'm going to lose. I always lose, but it's just occasionally nice when I get a little highlight along the way, a little drop of water in a desert of failure, which will aptly bring us to the next episode of Marco Polo. So I hope you can join me for that as we listen to the tune that is played by the Singing Sands. And let's see what lyrics J Jeremy Bentham, Doctor Who historian extraordinaire, brings to that. But in the meantime, this is going to be an epic old journey, but I hope you enjoy joining me on it, because these are the stories that, they're so near and yet so far. So I look forward to drawing the next line on the map along with you in the very next episode of Happy Times and Places. But until then, goodbye for now. Thank you so much for listening to Happy Times and Places, which is presented by me, Toby Hadoke, and my special guest, J Jeremy Bentham, who was doing his stuff in vision behind a chess set in front of a Dalek. Oh, and with such class. I'm so grateful to him. He's far too erudite to be on Facebook or social media of any kind. So buy Doctor Who, The Early Years. What a wonderful book it is. I'm grateful to Jeremy and to the many patrons who make this podcast possible, and they include Ruben Herfindahl, Stephen Moffat, David Trainier, Frank Shales, Risto Matti Saurillo, Barry Platt, Adam Parker, Graham Knott, Nathan Martin, Rick Moran, Gavin McLean, Ian K. McLachlan, Joe Llewellyn, Ian Key, Chris Hyam, Siobhan Galichon, Jason Gorman, Paul Dunn, Chris Dunford-Kelk, John Deere, Rob Dawson, Peter Crocker, Richard Chalk, Paul Cook, Jenny at Blue Box 99, Nigel Bromley, Tim Arding, and David. And the music is by Dave Gates, and the artwork by Dylan Patterson. If you would like to join that list of patrons, you can do so at patreon.com/Toby Hadoke, where you get advance releases, you get special access, you get bonus material, and you get everything, 6 months early at least, for Happy Times and Places, and a month or so in advance for the podcasts like Too Much Information and Indefinable Magic. And there are also other special little bits and bobs. You also help to keep these podcasts ad-free. There are no adverts here, and that's the way I would like to keep it. And one way I justify that to myself for the time that these things take is because people are kind enough to sign up for the monthly subscription, which begins for as little as £3 a month. And you get about 3 releases a week. So it works out as something like 25p per podcast. And less than that if you sign up for a year in one go, because you get a 10% discount on the full amount. There are higher tiers, but most things are available at the lowest tier. I know times are tough and the world is going doolally and everything is getting ridiculously expensive. So if you don't want to commit to a monthly thing, but might occasionally fancy chucking something my way, you can go to ko-fi.com/Toby Hadoke. I will still never take the shilling from the advertisers because it just wouldn't seem right. And it would be odd to break off going, and here's Darren Nesbitt's CV. And by the way, men, are you skinny? I'm not going to do that. But what costs you nothing, because I'm not going to keep... Well, I have to keep soliciting for money, but I at least try and do it in a way that gives you plenty of outs. But what you can do that costs you absolutely nothing is to go to iTunes or anywhere on the internet and give these podcasts 5 stars. They really help with our algorithms, to make our algorithms look tip-top and very sexy indeed. And I really want sexy algorithms. And a couple of lines of review. But word of mouth is good, Twitter is good, social media is good, forums are good. Just say nice things about these. It helps to enable them to stand out amongst the very crowded world of Doctor Who podcasting, and it's crowded with some high quality stuff. So I'm grateful to you. Mostly, I'm grateful just to anybody that listens, especially if you've got this far. So, but yeah, patreon.com/Toby Hadoke, kofi.com/Toby Hadoke, or iTunes, Patreon, social media, everywhere. Thank you. Blah-de-blah-de-blah. I'm also a comedian. I don't think anyone cares. The world of Doctor Who and comedy don't have the biggest yoke in their Venn diagram, but is it a Venn? No, it's a pie chart, isn't it? Pie chart has a yoke, a Venn diagram. Doesn't matter. There are more people who intersect between being exact about pie charts and Venn diagrams than there are being comedy and Doctor Who. Anyway, come and see my comedy nights, Excess Malarkey, every Tuesday in Manchester, or twitch.tv/Excess Malarkey. I'm feeling a bit bad that I didn't, at the very beginning, talk more about Jeremy's introduction, which was, really detailed and really nice. And, actually did touch upon, and I didn't really refer to it as much as I could have done. I wasted an opportunity there, because he was talking about how he'd not particularly liked the story as a youngster and has come to appreciate it as he got older. And that's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it? That you say, well, how do we assess that then? Should we like well, I love the fact that we constantly evolve, therefore, and what we like about the show, and that was a story that actually didn't grab him the first time round, but he came to appreciate when he started doing some of his archaeology into the show. And I love that about the show, is that we can return to something sometime later, or delve into something sometimes. I mean, I remember watching the Faceless Ones Part 1, which I'd never seen in full because I'd only seen the cut version, and suddenly seeing 2 or 3 shots of the chameleon's hand, and suddenly that whole episode, which I thought has been a bit dull, suddenly with those extra fractions of a second, suddenly was a little bit more atmospheric and a little bit more spooky, and so we can come back to things and suddenly find our experiences have changed, or our opinions have changed, or some new piece of information or exposure to a different aspect of it. And I love Jeremy's story there, and as I say, he's filmed his stuff, and I've not been putting these out on YouTube because they take much longer to do. I still have all the footage, so you can tell when I'm hugely unemployed, or on the scrap heap, when I start shoving these out on YouTube like shelling peas, and suddenly there's hours and hours of video because I've got nothing better to do. Yeah, he was great. He by a chessboard when he did the opening, and then when he chose his thing, there was an original Dalek behind him. So he's the real deal, and I'm still slightly in awe of Jeremy. So I'm really thrilled that he took part. And as I say, Ian K. McLachlan's contribution to the Dalek Master Plan went down very well. So much as I do have lovely people who've contributed the Keys of Marinus and the Sensorites and other early Doctor Who's. For this one, for season 1, I've decided to try and be brave and do the one that we can't see, that we don't know perhaps as well. I don't know, maybe you do know it as well, but I certainly feel it's the one, the exact details of which I know less well, even though I know the story and the character, and certainly what everything looks like because of all those gorgeous pictures. But experiencing the story is slightly more novel. So I hope you enjoyed that. But I particularly just wanted to pay tribute again in this sort of post-credits bit to Jeremy's introduction, which I thought was really top-notch, and actually got distracted in my own sort of contextualizing that I didn't refer back to him nearly enough. He's a smart guy, and I love that Doctor Who: The Early Years book. So anyway, there's more to come from Jeremy, and if that first episode's contribution is anything to go by, I think it's going to be, well, he's probably going to be the highlight. Then you'll have guff from me in between. But there we go. I shall try to guff as subtly as possible, as is only polite. Ta-ta.